you are like the poster boy of CityNews 95.7.
I am the poster boy. What do you think of that?
That means that you're like the chief talk show personality, which I think is really cool. And, we're proud to have you here as a part of our brand and getting the great messaging out around financial literacy. And you know what, Todd? I think you've broken down a lot of barriers.
You think?
With listeners. Yeah,
How
totally.
How so?
Nobody wants to talk about financial literacy. But you know what? We are bringing it to the forefront, which I think is really cool. And, we're talking about a lot of really interesting things like building credit. We're talking about real estate to first-time home buyers. And, these are great conversations to have. And I hope it's lots of great content.
And I must say, I truly enjoyed our chat with Leanne and James. Good guest.
They're really cool. And you know what? They're masters of what they do. And, I think it's really important, do I think Clinton is be all and end all of mortgage lending? I mean, I've overseen over 4,000 transactions. So, I've certainly have seen a lot, but I haven't seen it all. And I think it's really important to bring in, the people that have seen it. Like, for example, Leanne does a lot of alternative lending, and she does, some lending that maybe it takes a little bit more, work to make it happen, which is really cool. And James is a licensed real estate professional here in the province of Nova Scotia. And you know what? I don't think it's a really great time to be a realtor. I think it's a really hard time to be a realtor, in my opinion. There's not a lot of inventory out there. And if you're working with first-time home buyers, some of these buyers are, getting tired, and you have to make a lot of offers sometimes to even get a transaction. So it takes a lot of, guts to do it. And it's not just the opening the door and turning on the lights. And I think sometimes that's a perception that people have of realtors, but, they work really, really hard. And, they're really there to protect you for the biggest purchase. Yeah. We are here as mortgage brokers and, talking about financial literacy to protect your finances. And, the mortgage is the biggest debt, but it takes a village sometimes to make it happen. And we love to share, things about financial literacy with the village, which is really our listeners here on City News 95.7.
Yeah. Okay, so when it comes to mortgage lending and the application process, and I guess we'll kind of transition into some of that educational component to it. Might as well, right? This is what we're doing. We haven't really done this yet. Let's talk about, let's start educating people on what they should do when it comes to being financially literate and getting ready for the initial process of buying a home. What are some first things that you would recommend that they do?
Well, there's really three cornerstones of mortgage lending. The first one is credit, and then there's assets, and then there's income. I think knowing where you stand in all of kind of those cornerstones is really important. And sometimes consumers, might have an issue with one of those cornerstones. And it doesn't mean it's the end of the world. It doesn't mean that you can never get a mortgage ever. There's always a solution. But I think, as we've stated, sometimes the more challenging files, you might have to have a little bit more skin in the game. It might be higher risk to the lender. That's okay. There's always a way to make it work. And sometimes it's just about that feedback and making a roadmap and making a plan. We talked a little bit about the blog post that we have on our website. We have, I think, over 500 blog posts on there. And several years ago, I wrote a blog post that said, any consumer can get a mortgage in 72 months or less, regardless of what their situation is. Yeah, 72 months is a long time. That's 6 years. Mm-hmm. But, the sins that you've done today are going to stay with you maybe for a while. But usually if people have a bit of a challenge, and I'm usually talking about things like credit. If there is a challenge, it doesn't stay on there forever. It does eventually go away. It's not like you're in purgatory forever. And I think the real key is, if there has been some challenges before, you need to learn from your mistakes. And I think some of that is education. And we love educating the consumers. And I think, that's really sometimes what differentiates an unbiased mortgage professional from maybe someone walking into the branch. We see the actual credit bureau. So we see the skinny. We know what's going on. Mm-hmm. We know when there's mispayments. We know what the utilization is. We know kind of what the high limit on that account was. We can see all these things. And I sometimes feel at the branch level, they don't necessarily see the credit score or the report kind of in detail of like what we see. So I think, for us, we're able to, work with the consumer. And we also use commercial account with Equifax, and we've done investigations for consumers because sometimes there's errors on the credit report.
Right.
But credit isn't the be all and end all of mortgage lending. It's not just I have good credit. Yes, I'm going to get the best rate. I can do 5% down.
It's one of the pillars.
It's definitely one of the pillars.
Yeah.
But I think income is just as important.
Yeah, absolutely.
You need to be able to service the debt.
Yeah.
You don't want to sit in a home that you can't afford and you need to eat craft dinner. I'm going to bring back some of these things that I've said over the
Nothing
last.
wrong with craft dinner.
Yeah, I like craft dinner too, but you don't want to have to eat the craft dinner, and you don't want to sit in a home that you can't furnish. So obviously having income and being responsible with your indebtedness, and that's the house, but the indebtedness might also talk about car loans. Or maybe unsecured debt. That's
a bee in your bonnet is car loans, isn't it?
I would say car loans is probably one of my biggest bees in my bonnet. Yeah. And, in our guide to homeownership, our actual hard copy of our guide, it's in there. It's on our website. I've even shared the meme to be like, when you're buying a house, do not buy a new car.
Yeah.
And I've even had consumers that we have a pre-approval for, and maybe there's some room in the ratios, and they write me, they're like, Clinton, I think I'm going to buy a new car. Please cease and desist immediately. And you know what? The people that are listening that are working at car dealerships, and if you work in the
you have
car
some clients,
business,
I'm sure, that are.
We definitely have clients. Cars are a necessary thing. They're usually a depreciating asset, but they're necessary. And everyone needs a car. Probably in Halifax, we have a very driving culture, so I understand you need it. But you don't need to go out and buy a new car when you're buying a house, usually.
Yes. Especially when you've got an offer in and you're waiting for it to close.
People still do it. Trust me, they do it, and it's like the shock and dismay.
Yeah.
I find the number one issue is new construction. It takes a long time to get a new construction completed. So guess what? Sometimes we need a new credit bureau. What pops up?
New vehicle. F-150. Ouch. $800 a month. Oh, no.
Here's the one thing. Not many people can buy new cars right now because there's not a lot of inventory. Just like there's not a lot of inventory of new homes. So you drive by these car dealerships, there's no cars. I had my vehicle in to get serviced this weekend. Guess what? No cars there. They have a whole dealership of all these vintage cars on display.
Yeah.
There's not a new car there to buy.
Would they ever love a trade-in from you, though?
I mean, they would. They probably pay me top dollar, but then I wouldn't have a car. So you know what? It's the same thing. And you know what? I'm in looking actively to buy a new home. Mm-hmm. I've joked about, I'm going to buy the cottage on the shore. I'm looking for that too. But I'm actively looking for a new home in Halifax. So guess what? I'm not going to go buy a new vehicle. I know better to take my own advice. I can listen to myself. So we've talked about credit and we've talked about income. And that really sometimes is the debt to income ratio.
Want to buy my place in Spryfield?
Your place in Spryfield,
sure.
The asset has really increased.
It has.
So, that's a little side note for Todd and I to chat about later, and maybe we'll talk about this later in the month.
Yeah.
But the other thing that's really important is asset. Mm-hmm. And we can't just think that, okay, we have good income, we have good credit, we can buy a home. You still need to have the assets, and the assets could be our RSP, it could be savings, it could be a gift from mother, father, brother, sister. The assets are just a very important piece of the pie. And the minimum down payment in Canada is 5% of the purchase price for the first $500,000. And then you would need to get a high ratio insured mortgage. And, we can certainly go down the rabbit hole of all of the mechanics of mortgage lending. And, we're certainly going to drill down into this income and the assets and the credit. And we'll certainly really want you to phone in and ask us all kinds of great questions later this month.
All right,
we'll be live on the air.
So to that, let's tee up the rest of the month. Let everybody know what they can expect here in CityNews 95.7.
It's going to be financial literacy all month, all through November. We're going to be doing 2 live shows, and we're going to do phone-ins. So if you really do want to get on the air, we'll certainly tee that up, and Todd will obviously let the listeners know.
Yes, I will.
I'm going to take calls live on the air. Yep. And at the end of the month, we're going to really talk about how can we keep financial literacy month going all through the year, because really we want our consumers, we want our listeners to be in the best financial position that they can be going into 2022. We've gone through a hard couple of years here, Todd, and there's going to be a light at the end of the tunnel. And we're going to talk about other things like inflation and probably the Bank of Canada. And talk lots more about mortgage lending and real estate.
Lovely, thank you so much. It's been a great chat as always.
Thanks for having me.
We'll do it all month, all November. Thank you.
Thanks, Todd.
That's Clinton Wilkins, myself, Todd Veinotte. Mortgage 101, your guide to homeownership financial literacy month. We'll be talking all month. We'll be back on City News 95.7. Thanks for listening.